What are your concerns or about bias or challenges that you see around AI?
I think my main concerns about bias are to do with how the models are working rather than the data, rather than the analysis that we do with the data using the tech, if that makes sense. Because I think for me, it's the interplay between making use of the power that these models can use to give us different insights into the data, but I'm always going to do the interpretation of that in combination. So it's more to do with how the technology is developed and whether there are biases introduced into that rather than the analytic tools themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I could build that in later. Gonzalo, can you just introduce you quickly and?
Sure. Nice to see you all. And actually, I remember being in Surrey at one of those workshops, I don't know, more than 20 years ago, at least, if not 25 years ago. I'm a professor counseling psych at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, but I spend 2/3 of my time now in Chile. So I'm in the South Hemisphere. It's very hot here. I've been doing, I've been using qualitative data or thinking about qualitative data. Sometimes now I use less the software actually, but I'm thinking about it. And in answering your question, Susan, I read your entry. I've been reading some about AI and I think that probably similar to the questions that Christina has about, in some way, are these the same biases that a search will have when you search for something? And also, how is it that it's male center, young center, North Hemisphere, industrialized center, etc. The whole thing about what is it that actually this intelligence is doing, and how is it just reproducing what we all, I guess, we are aware our software, our platforms reproduce, which is, sort of one.
So you might have seen this image I've created with DALL-E. With several attempts to get there, and it shows the researcher looking at, so to speak, an AI brain, and the bias that kind of comes with it, that we are kind of already know that the models have biases, and that, and the reflection in the water, meaning that we have to kind of do something as reflect on it. But also you see there is a reflection in the water of the researcher. So, and you will hear that more and more in my presentation, we all have biases, so none of us is without a bias. So we always also have to reflect on our own bias, and that always has been part of the entire, if you learn qualitative research methodology, first thing we learned is that it's subjective and that we have to reflect on our own biases. And what I hear a lot in the discussion is more what we see on these attempts, at first attempts that I got also from DALL-E. We're looking at the AI and it's immediately, the data set is a training data, is biased and it's all a black box and we cannot work with it. And I will just give you, it's just also some ideas I have and also to encourage discussion and thoughts about it, what I want to give you in that presentation. But I think it's important that we're not only looking at the AI and say, well, it's all biased and, what are we going to do with it? And I have some suggestion on what we can do with it, similar to the kind of direction Christina is pointing towards. But she also has some concerns about the models, and I will also address that. So where is a problem, and that is, I think in these two quotes we see a lot of what we always hear or see in the discussions. If you're interested in the AI qualitative data analysis, Chris too has written, but like 3 or 4 articles by now in the TQR journal. It's all available for download. If I share my presentations, you also, and with the recording, you also get the links in the reference. So what he is writing is that deep learning model that's trained using a data set that itself contains biased information. Yes, we know that. And then it's kind of like, okay, well, what are we doing with that? And then the danger, of course, is that whatever comes out, so the text it produces may be then also biased towards certain group or certain people. So that is often what we hear and read in the discussion. And then Christian makes some suggestions. And he said, well, we need to be transparent about it and disclose the biases. And we already know what the biases are, and I will talk a bit more about that. And then we have to take some measure to mitigate those biases. And in order to do that, he said the first step, and I think I completely agree with that, you have to know your data material. Otherwise, you cannot evaluate the outcome. So you cannot just upload, thousands and thousands of pages and just click on a button and the AI does the analysis. Or even if it's not doing, it's just doing something. If you don't know your data, you have no way of knowing and evaluating the outcome. So that is kind of the first prerequisite. And the other suggestion he's made, we need to check the results using triangulation. So that's a very common procedure anyway in research. Not everybody is doing it, but it might be a possible suggestion to check the results back against other research or against other data. We will have to see whether that is really necessary depending on how you work with the AI. And of course, I have a certain vision on how to do that, and it's kind of built into the tool I am envision, and we hopefully can soon get our fingers on it. So I'm the visionary, and I have to have my tech people to actually put that into practice. But you will get to see more of the idea a bit later. And I think when you see what is possible, hopefully soon in the future, you will see that point. Well, and then the fourth suggestion he made it was we need to ensure that the training data has no bias. And that's also something I have been hearing that people said, oh, we have to train our own model and we cannot work with the cloud and it has to be all offline or our own networks. And then some of you might already know that, especially if you come from a more technical field, but a lot of people are not aware what's behind this model and that this kind of solution is not possible, at least not now. And we're talking about the now. But I think maybe in a year's time, if people are busy with getting models smaller, the Central University has just come up with a new mathematical formula to box it in a little bit smaller. Samsung has just integrated AI on their phones. Apple will certainly do that. So we will see that also in the future, but we have to kind of live with what we have now, and then I think things will become a bit easier in the future. So these are all different models that are, we have ChatGPT-1 here, 2 is 3 is here, ChatGPT-4 apparently does not. I've been researching, so there wasn't quite sure how many parameters the model is in size. So the size of the models are often given to you in terms of parameters, and some actually use tokens. And you see how much it is, 100 billion. And here above here, we are also at 1 trillion parameters. And that is something you could never realize on your own computers or servers. It does takes lots of computing power. What if you hear about training models, then that often means, well, we take a financial model and continue to train it. And that is something we could also certainly do for qualitative research, but we always have to kind of start somewhere. We cannot train a foundational model. And here you see a bit more written about it, and that's more if I share the presentation so you have a bit more detail. But basically, for a lay non-technical person to know, is this kind of, okay, parameters are the things that are adjusted when a model learns. And there's an example that might help some of you is, a similar example would be a linear regression model where the parameters are the slope and the y-intercept of the line that best fits the data. So once there's some more training data coming in, the slope is adjusted, the parameter is adjusted, so the model learns. So and then we have, what is it, 100 billion or even a trillion of those parameters that are in the model that are used, that will be used to train the model. And then some, like Meta, for example, they also kind of say we have 70 billion tokens or even more than that. So some actually talk about tokens. And the token is a kind of training data that goes in. And then maybe that is a bit easier to understand. But there could be a word, a subword, or just certain characters. So what these large language models do, or the neural networks, is they take the text apart and then also convert it into numerical formats, often vectors. So whatever a model does behind the scene is transforming it into something we would be able to understand. But this is how these models are able to learn and then to give us the answers that what we get when we actually work with the models. So it's not like the number of words that go in to train a model, but it's a number of tokens. So it's always, if it's 1,000 words, you might have 2,000 or 3,000 tokens. And it's also, that also varies by language and how that is taken apart. And yeah, so how does the parameters and tokens relate to each other? So tokens are the input data, and neural network learns to understand the relationship between words by adjusting the parameters. Yeah, so that's how these two actually relate. And you can always multiply the number, if you talk about parameters and tokens. And here, to just give you an idea how immensely large those models are, and that is not a solution to kind of, we just produce an unbiased model. And then the question should always be, is that at all possible? So that's not something in the cards that we can say, we do it better than what the big techs have been doing. So if we talk about a model with 70 billion parameters, so what which in ChatGPT 3 had 150 billion. So that's about 2 Kindle Store libraries, so to speak. Yeah, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Yeah, if you look at model side and thinking about, let's train our own unbiased models. And now what I also already mentioned, we already know in which direction the bias goes. So the training data for foundational models are basically scraping the internet, the books, the web pages, scientific articles, Wikipedia, instructions manuals, everything that can be found online, other text, blogs, newspaper articles, and so on. And we also know that most of these come from Western cultures, and a lot of that is also in English. And we already know that. And so the big techs are actually working on mitigating the bias. This is a schema from Meta, and they are working with real people. They have been asking, experts from different fields, also political science, people like you and me with lived experience in whether certain cultural areas or disability areas or wherever, they expect to be a bias. So they have, this is just a small section here. They have about 500 of these parameters, not parameters, but they call it axes, the things they actually look at, and then they look for what could be a potential bias. And now if you think about, I'm German, I have been living in a number of different countries, I've been educated in certain subjects, working with qualitative data for a long time. I have I'm a mother, I have a certain experience, and yeah, so I am full of, I wouldn't, but bias as well, because I see the world through my lens and you see the world through your lens. So there is no person that doesn't have any bias. It's just then a matter to have unbiased data. It's I think unbiased is the wrong word here, but adding all these different perspectives to these models. So one simple example, maybe also very stereotypical, but if the model, for example, would have a sentence or have training data in there, women like shopping. Yeah, and if that is realized, then other data is added to the model, men like shopping. So the model knows also that women like shopping, men like shopping. So and that is also in terms of cultural aspects and age aspects and so on. So they just add more of these data, and there's humans involved in doing that in order to give these multiple perspectives, so to kind of balance out the different biases. I think that's a better word. So we cannot have unbiased data. We can just have all these different perspectives in there, so they balance each other out. And while I was actually, preparing the blog where this presentation is based on, so if you haven't seen it, so you can also see it all up written up. I'd say now but I know not everybody might, but if you are a scientist and from the Western world and have written articles, well, you have been contributing to that bias. And that is really the question, who is without bias may cast the first stone. Because well, maybe it comes later. I thought another slide would be coming now, but it's still coming. And it's not something that suddenly now is new. That is, now we have all these bias in research because the AI is bringing the bias and giving all these skewed results. So it is something that has always been discussed in qualitative research. And I'm really giving you here old references in order to tell you, well, that has been discussed 30, 40, 50 years already. So the Denson and Lincoln quote is from the Handbook of Qualitative Research. And they wrote, the bricolayer understands that research is an interactive process shaped by his or her personal history, biography, gender, social class, and race and ethnicity, and those of the people in the setting. So as what I told you about me, what kind of bias I bring to my research. And then they continue, so the bricolayer knows that science is power because all research results have political implication. There is no value-free science in every piece. And I think mathematical formulas, well, that might be a bit more objective, but even we know from physicists that it's all not just as clear cut as we even in the natural science would like it to be. And then they also say, so they tell narratives or stories and within a specific frame. And often that is also called a certain paradigm they're working from within. So this has been discussed for a long time. And it's only something, a skill that we already should have as qualitative researchers, to reflect on our own bias. And then, of course, we have to take into account the AI bias as well. But it is actually a skill a qualitative researcher should already bring. And now that's the slide I was looking for earlier. And this is the bias that we ourselves, if you are a scientific researcher having written articles, have brought to those large language models, because it does contain published articles if they're available open source. So there are Gubas, that Belgium researchers, and also Belgium as well as the Netherlands, there is a colonial history, and they have looked at here. it's not the journal, particular journals they have looked at, but you can see that in the block, it's more extensive. But so in 2003, the journals they looked at and the periods they looked at a 1 year period, 70% of the publications that were studies done in less developed countries, they didn't even include the local researchers as co-authors. It was then, of course, the Western perspective that went into these articles, because maybe often they were still having that more colonial attitude and saying, well, those local researchers, they don't know as much as we do. And then I also looked for something that's a bit newer. You can say, well, that was 20 years ago, but also in more recent publications, and that is again a particular field that NODA looked at. And from the 204 manuscripts submitted between, I think, 1980 and 1980 and 2018 to 2019. So 80% came from Western authors and from non-Western authors. And in total, about 60 something were accepted. And then if we talk in percentage now, not numbers. So out of these 67 articles, and the ones that were accepted, it was 11 to 3% the comparison between Western and non-Western authors. So in a lot of scientific publications, and look at all the A-rated journals, where are they located? They are not located in South Africa or in any of the less developed countries. It's all the more advanced Western. I'm not sure whether I'm saying this right now, so sorry if I don't want to offend anyone, but I hope you get the point here. But I guess a lot of, because presenting this also, of course, from a German Western perspective, a lot of the researchers from this area, these are the ones that also complain. I don't think the loudest, but I think also from, of course, we know also from some other countries that they especially say, well, because the data is skewed and it wouldn't fit to interpret data that I collect in my country. So we see voices from different parts of the world. And while I was thinking about writing this article, thinking through this topic, I was watching this comedy show, and I just put bits and pieces together from that show, where I thought, he has a very brilliant view on all, like being able to see also these stereotypes in different cultures, and I just thought he would be a brilliant qualitative researcher. So let's look at this now, and just also to have a bit of fun and entertainment here. So I just thought this is a bit of an entertaining, nice example, how prejudice is often rooted in cultural stereotypes and also in shared experience. And we, of course, see that also in writing, everything that people put on their website, that people put in their blogs, that maybe we put in our articles. And that is a kind of bias we do also see in the models. But now the question is, so what can we do? So we know that already, and we know, because it's still a black box, but my question is always, even if we would know all the millions of documents and articles that have gone into training the data, we would not be able to even look at all of this and comprehend all the training data that's in there. And I think it is good enough that we know it is biased, and also we know in what direction it is biased. And that's something now we can deal with. So that is why my suggestion is well, use an interactive AI tool and not one that promises results with a push on the button. Because if, that's a black box, you just put your data there, you push on a button, something gets out. Then what do you do with that? Because then you have no control over the process, and you don't know what the AI did. So this is an approach that yeah, that's basically also my vision how to work with it. So basically you can start a project, you describe your project. So you provide context information to the bot. So it knows a bit about your project. You also know something about your data, whether the focus group data or it's interviews or it's reports, and what kind of people you have been talking on with and so on. And then you begin a conversation with your AI assistant. And this is an example. It is actually based on some of the experiments I have been running. So I have uploaded 5 documents on the effect of AI on the labor market. And so I didn't put all the answers here, but just that you get a bit of a feeling how this can actually look like. And you don't even in that context have to say based on the document provided, but you could. Yeah, so the question is, how does generative AI change the requirements for specialist skill in different professional fields? So that is part of the research question. I also told it a bit what's behind the research question, but it already kind of knew that based on the context information I provided. So then the assistant looks at the documents and says the documents you upload provide a detailed look at and gives and provides an answer. And then I can evaluate that answer, and I can also check whether there is some bias in the answer. But basically, it kind of retrieves what's in the document. So what's the bias that it gets out? If you would ask it to interpret, that's a different story. Or if you ask to summarize a 50-page document, you get half a page. Well, then the AI decides something on what basis it will summarize it. But this is something different. You just ask something very specific. And what you will be able to do also in our software is to, we call it section identifier. So you can even direct the AI very specifically to a particular section in your document. So the answer can be even more focused. So, but you can then also say just, what is the answer in doc 1 provided to the first research question? So the AI know what the first research question is, and I labeled the document doc 1, and then it has a longer name, so you don't always have to write what the entire name is, but you see in the answer, document 1, working world scenarios, and then provides the answer. And then I ask it to pull out the list of the professional groups out of document 2, and ask it then for document 3 to pull out the list plus some short description. So this is of course all a bit experimental to see how it works. And then you got the answers. And then of course at some point, you have to do something with those answers and have to summarize and interpret and write your own text about it. So whatever comes out is not your result. It's just the AI pulling out that information out of the text. So that is where I say you don't need to code anymore, because you can just ask questions and the AI pulls that information out of the text. And then you can also say, well, I don't really understand that last point that you just gave me. So can you give more detail? Or you can also ask for giving more quotes, and it also provides a reference. So it does tell you where it got the answer from, and you can click on that and also visit the original source. So that's of course also important to check back where the data is coming from. That also helps you to evaluate, is there some bias in the answer, or has it made up the answer, or is that if you feel like there is a bias in the document, maybe it's already in the data you have been feeding it. And then you can also ask a question like, now look at all 5 documents together. Are there overlaps in the documents, and pull those out, or are there also individual mentions? Because you don't want to look at everything that's common, but you might also want to identify like single events in single documents. But that's also possible. And you can also do things like write up the interpretation, your summary, and then upload that again to the AI tool and say, please look at my summary. Does that sound about right based on what we have been talking about? Because the AI will remember the dialogue. And then you can also ask, is there anything I missed, or are there any gaps? So just to give you an idea how an analysis with an AI assistant can work, where you as researcher stay in control. And it's not just a black box, and whatever gets out, you can evaluate. So you can check the answer. And the analysis will stay within the data corpus that you have given the AI unless you explicitly ask it. So that's something also interesting. Because if you have some theories that, my idea is at some point you can upload, entire papers with the theoretical framework, where you can say, okay, how does that now relate to the theory of Noda and Smith or whatever? Yeah, or if it's like a common theory like Bourdieu or whatever, very like an older theory you're working with, which you can assume that the AI knows because it has been trained on that data. So Bourdieu, it knows. And so you can also ask it to how does that relate to the theory of economic capital of Bourdieu, if that would be fitting. Yeah, so but then you explicitly ask the bot to go out of the context of the data, and then you know that you did that. And so you can reflect directly on when the answer contains bias, and then of course you should also always do that with your own interpretation. And that is kind of the second point. Use the skills that you have learned as a qualitative researcher. Again, we have an old quote here from von Manen, and he writes, being reflective means constantly having a conversation with yourself. And now we have a conversation with ourselves and with the bot. And rather than simply presenting the results as facts, the reflexive researcher actively forms interpretation and then examines the origin of those interpretations. So we should just need to continue to apply these foundational rules, basically, or good practice rules of qualitative research to deal with our own bias. And now, of course, the additional point is that we need to take into account the bias that might potentially be in the answer. But I don't really think it's the example I've shown you. It's because the bot just kind of looks into your data, and as long as you don't ask it to come up with a full-fledged interpretation, it will just retrieve what's in the data. And the last tip here I'm having, and then we still have a bit of time. We have a bit of time for discussion here as well. You can also ask the AI. I mean, it is a dialogue. And if you spot in an answer, do you know what? I think there is a strong whatever bias in that data. Could you please go back and reflect and dig a bit deeper in the data? Is that really true? And the AI will do that. This is just this assistant that never gets tired. So you can actually point it out. And now we know that the companies who build these foundational models, they are aware of it, and they try to mitigate that as well by adding more perspectives. So the AI usually has more perspectives, and if you point it out and ask it, so give me another perspective, this seems to be biased, and ask it for a second or even a third perspective, it will give you these perspectives, and then you can work with that. And again, it's not these are not the results, these are just things you work with. And then you you make up your own mind and build up your own interpretation. And that's where we're here at the end of kind of my input, and saying, yes, of course, we do have to reflect the biases that are in the AI models, but we also not to just point the finger to somebody else, but also kind of point the fingers to ourselves, and how that we have contributed to that, but also in the research process always reflect our own position as well.
Are you using the pay assistance, or are you using a quote free assistant?
Well, as Christina pointed out at the beginning, I'm building my own tool right now. So the process you have seen, that is kind of a reflection of my own tool. But right now, while this is still in process, I'm practicing with I've kind of built my own GPT so the paid version of ChatGPT.
Yep.
But
Okay.
then yeah, you always run out of the dialogue, or it just has all these, the dialogue gets too long, and it's not, of course, not purpose built. So we kind of purpose build something like that follows kind of the process that I've been sketching, because that's my vision on how I think we can analyze data.
Susanne, maybe may I?
Yeah, sure.
Because I find there's a highly stimulating and very engaging topic on biases, of course, in research and sciences. And the way you also presented it, right, so that there is no unbiased thinking in that sense, and things that originate out of our thinking will inherently hold some form of bias or another. So in that sense, I mean, the AI is also a beautiful tool to uncover biases in that regard. If you converse with an AI as you would, in your example, of course, as well, where you have interactions as you would with colleagues or editors or whoever, they can help you to basically find out more about your own biases in some regards. And I think that's where this is a beautiful tool to have these conversations. A thing that I often wonder then is, what about as Rumsfeld called them, the unknown unknowns, the biases that neither the AI is aware of nor myself, and that potentially can skew whole findings, whole results, hypotheses, because we just lacking a vital piece of information that would change everything if we had it. So, and I've seen that there is one, it's called Ground News. It's also a AI-based news service that allows at least for some form of transparency. It says, so this is how we do it, and this is where we kind of locate the information on a spectrum of factual, not factual, and so on and so forth. And I could also see how this kind of transparency could be one way, at least, to show the scientists or the researchers what is still the unknown in this regard, or where there is need room for further reflection or improvement.
Yeah, I mean, good point. But that has always had been there, whether we have AI or not, and that's why it's more like, now everybody suddenly says, oh, it's all bias, and in a sense I say, well, it's very good that we have that discussion, because we always had bias, and always people never thought about it or never reflected it, and that's why I think it's good to put that into the foreground, because it always has been there, and it's just kind of my point to also kind of say, yeah, it's not new. And of course we have the third party, but what can help, I think it even, it may not always, you may not always be able to uncover the unknown, but working together with other people, because then somebody can point something out. And with the AI, at least if we use it correctly, like as a sparring partner in a sense, yeah, which you can. And I think a lot of people have not really discovered that yet, because what we see a lot online is these promises, oh, AI is now taking the work for you. There's, press on that button, your analysis is done, or press on that button, your coding is done. I don't believe in that kind of procedure. So if we really rethink it and in that conversation, then you have at least the AI where you can, maybe mitigate also your own bias. And that's my interpretation. Do you see any bias, or do you see anything that's off? Or also working with other researchers, including, the AI as well. Yeah, and that I'm looking forward to that once it's implemented, because the idea that we're going to have that as well, that within the tool you can work as a team, you can talk to each other, you can also talk to the AI, and then you can work together and uncover each other's biases, or interpretation, or somebody said, well, why did you get that idea, or why did you ask that question, or why did you come up with that prompt? Yeah, or also reflecting on, because it's a matter of, I can only encourage you to experiment with it, because it's also learning how to write a good question. And sometimes you get a shitty answer, but oftentimes it's because you have the prompt wasn't good, or then you can just try again. And we have to, it's a bit of trial and error, and I will provide some guidance once we're coming out, but I think you need to adjust it to all of your research projects. It's all of these, every research project will be a bit different, but there are some general rules how to do that. And the the one thing that I do actually is it's nice. I mean, if your grammar is wrong or you forgot a word or you have a typo, it doesn't matter. You know, the AI overlooks those things. But sometimes you do ask kind of in the wrong way. And and the other beautiful thing, it's language is not a matter. It's not a problem anymore. You know, you can have French data, but if you need to write your report in English, you just ask your questions in English. The AI will understand it and put out, you know, the whatever language you prefer. So it's whatever language you start writing, that's how it's going to be respond. Also, if your data is in a different language.